Having finished our sermon series on Job, our scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said, 'He is one, and beside him there is no other.' And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And no one dared ask him any question. This is the reading of the Lord this morning. So some of you were in Bible study last week, and you might have heard a story about my neighbors and my relationship to my neighbors, and how maybe it's not always what it should be. And I thought, instead of regaling you with a similar story told maybe more ridiculously, I would take one step back and tell you about my neighbors when I lived in New York. Because apartment living is hard, and you're squeezed in with a lot of space that no matter how old or new your building is, you can really hear your neighbors and what they're up to. And to be a good neighbor, from talking to you all last week here in Indianapolis, it is to be kind and considerate and to sort of know what's going on with your neighbors and to take care of them. In New York, the best thing you can do is keep yourself to yourself. There'll be no knocking on doors. There'll be no cookies. And there certainly will be no friendship between neighbors. That's just being rude. So in an effort to be a good neighbor, we didn't ever say hi to anyone down the hall. And when we saw them, we just sort of, "I don't know you're there." And when we, went to the mailboxes, we really made sure to keep ourselves to ourselves. And our neighbors next door were fantastic. They owned an apartment in Florida and spent most of the time there. So really, they were delightful. Our neighbors above us, I don't even know that we had neighbors above us. That's how wonderful they were. We never heard them. And our neighbors across the way on the other side, well, they weren't so great. They had the audacity to play the classical piano right at dinner time with the windows open, and this beautiful music might annoyingly waft in and just serenade you over dinner. So inconsiderate. As much as our neighbors and keeping ourselves to ourselves was okay and very nice, let us pretend that for a little while we weren't surrounded by millions of other people in our tiny square. Our downstairs neighbors were hard. They weren't hard because they were mean or rude or any of those things, but they were loud. They were very loud, and they were mostly loud when things were not going well in their marriage or in their parenting. I had never lived near someone who was quite that voluminous over quite so many things. And I always got concerned when it sounded like all the dishes were getting broken. And I didn't know what to do. How do I be a good neighbor in this situation? How do I answer this question of what am I supposed to do? And a lot of the times, in the code of being a good neighbor in New York, we would just watch our show a little louder and let them be themselves downstairs. But that was really hard when we heard them yelling at their child. And I know that life is really hard. And it's really unfair that when you're trying to solve your family, I can hear everything upstairs. And it's extra hard when I put my ear to the floor to listen in as to what is going on down there. It's really unfair for you trying to live out your personal life if I'm nosing in. But it's so hard for me not to nose in when it sounds like you need help. And that's the crux of this really challenging question. Jesus gets asked this question that should be an easy question. He's not the first Jewish leader to answer this question. What is the greatest commandment? Many, many centuries before, a Jewish leader had been asked this question. Someone had come up to the leader's name is Hillel and said, if you can tell me all of the law in one sentence so I can memorize it, I will stand on one foot. And the leader said, love God and do to others as you would have them do to you. All of the law hangs on these premises. Now go and study. If you've ever played the game Othello, that little flipping tile game, it says 5 minutes to learn, a lifetime to master. That's what's going on with our text. When Jesus or the Rabbi Hillel says the whole code of the prophets rests on 2 commandments, love God, love your neighbor, that sounds really easy. I love God, and I love my neighbor even when they play that beautiful piano music at dinner time. I love that. I will get over the fact that it's not silence and it's just stunning. But sometimes, how do we love our neighbor in a way that is authentic to who our neighbor is and what they need and what love is supposed to look like? Sometimes, I'm guessing you have all had neighbors who are too neighborly. Maybe you've had neighbors who aren't neighborly enough. Maybe you've been a good neighbor. Maybe you've been a bad neighbor. In my New York sensibilities, when somebody left some cookies on my porch without a note, Daniel and I brought them in. I go, what do we do with these? We don't know where they're from. So in true millennial fashion, we took a picture and posted it on Facebook and said, did anyone leave these on our porch? We want to know if they're safe to eat. And no one responded. And we left them there right by the door as if bringing them in would contaminate them for like 2 weeks. Because, what if they weren't for us? What if someone wanted them back? I don't know. And then we broke down and just ate them. All of them. Almost one sitting. It was like 6 months later before our next door neighbor came over and said, did you like the cookies I brought you? And we were like, they were from you. Oh, thanks. Yeah, we ate them, and there weren't even razor blades or poison inside. We struggle sometimes to know what the right culture of neighbors are. I think the answer is a neighbor is one who we seek service from and who we seek to serve. And it's easy when those neighbors are nearby because, like I said, living in an apartment is hard work. There's not a lot of help. The elevators are usually broken. It's just tough to be that close together. And so you help each other out as best you can. Without talking or making eye contact, you might hold that elevator. Maybe you help lift something in. But when there's more space, life is still tricky. So we know that our next door neighbors and our across the street neighbors might help us in our way. But when does that proximity stop? When are you not my neighbor? Is that 2 streets away? Is that 2 blocks away? 2 towns away? Is it if I just didn't know that you left a note on my cookies, or then you're not my neighbor? There's this question about who's the neighbor. That's where we get Jesus' story about Good Samaritan, wondering who the neighbor is. And I think the answer, as tricky as it is everyone. It's this idea, this thing of neighbor making. That even when the person isn't close by, maybe we go out of our way to make the neighbor, to bring them closer. So that's going to those far edges of society, the far edges of our community, sort of like our food for come or our shoe boxes. We seek to bring people a little closer in proximity so that we can make them into neighbor, so that we can love them and they can love us in return. Because ultimately, the answer for me with my ear to the floor was to call 911 and to say, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do, but I'm so worried about the kids downstairs. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if the police came, I don't know. But I can promise I kept my ear to that floor for the rest of the night, trying to make sure that what I had done was an expression of love and not something that was problematic. And sometimes being a neighbor means taking a risk. Sometimes being a neighbor means stepping outside of what is comfortable to do what we think is right, but to have the humility to acknowledge that maybe it wasn't. And to know that in that attempt to have the graciousness to receive the help of our neighbors, take those cookies inside and eat them. But also to acknowledge that that help is sometimes hard to give. Because sometimes we're just one little person. And being a neighbor or neighbor making, if I can find my pocket, is bringing people closer. So we go from 1 to 2 to many. Because ultimately, we're all connected. And it's this sense of neighbor making that joins hands, that joins hearts, that spreads love. Because it's not easy, you might notice the very middle is taped together. Because sometimes those relationships fracture. Sometimes we stop holding hands. Sometimes we hurt other people. And we need a way to repair that relationship. We need a way to connect ourselves. And it turns out that there's enough tape to do that. Maybe not right away, but over time, with prayer and with honest expression of, I'm sorry, I was trying to help. Accept my apology and I hope you'll forgive me. Because we often step on each other's toes. Or maybe we don't step far enough. But we need to try. We need to try to bring each other closer so that we can be better neighbors, so we can love God, so we can love ourselves and our neighbors as ourselves. Because ultimately, that's the commandment. That's all there is. We've got so many chapters in this book. So many books filled with so many chapters telling us so many stories about so many things. And sometimes we need the condensed version. And this is it. Love God. Love yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't hurt if you add cookies to that. But if the person who you are giving the cookies to is afraid of your cookies and hides them at the front door and doesn't remember to apologize or even acknowledge they got them for 6 months, remember that sometimes being a neighbor means acknowledging we've goofed, acknowledging that we need a little help, or that maybe that person just doesn't know the cookies are safe to eat yet, until the internet tells them that yes, in fact it is. So extend a hand. Make a neighbor as best you can, loving in a way that uplifts you, uplifts that other person, and honors God. May we all be neighborly this week.